Okay, this is the final lesson of Unit 1. It is number 1.13, and it's called Global Africans. Today we'll be looking at the origins of the African diaspora before the transatlantic slave trade, and the reasons why Africans went to Europe and Europeans went to Africa in the late 1400s and early 1500s. We'll also see how the early forms of slave labor on Portuguese colonized islands in the Atlantic Ocean became a model for a new type of large scale agricultural slave labor system. This model would soon be replicated in the Americas, and the toil of enslaved Africans would become the foundation of the entire global economy. So let's recap with a couple of things here. We've seen how the trans-Saharan trade enriched the Sudanic empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. By the 1500s, Songhai was in decline. This was because the Portuguese started trading with Africa by sea, bypassing the trans-Saharan trade routes. This trade eventually disappeared, which led to the decline and fall of the Songhai Empire. It also brought Portugal into direct contact with sub Saharan Africa, meaning below, that is, south of the Sahara. The Portuguese started trading with African kingdoms on the coast for things like salt, ivory, and gold, but they also purchased slaves from African rulers who had prisoners to sell. Several West African kingdoms became wealthier and more powerful by participating in this early slave trade, although it soon began to have a destabilizing effect on their governments. The immediate effects of the growing trade relationship between Africa and Europe included the presence of more white Europeans in Africa, but it also meant the relocation of Africans to Europe. So, this is really the start of the African diaspora, as Africans are starting to become a global presence, especially in big European port cities. A couple of key terms here. This peninsula is actually called Iberia, and it includes both Spain and Portugal. There are some big Iberian port cities like Seville, which is in Spain, and Lisbon, which is the capital of Portugal. Sometimes the African social elite, the upper classes, would move to Iberian cities for diplomatic or religious reasons or to pursue education. Some Africans also arrived in Europe as slaves. Enslaved Africans in Europe filled many different roles. Many were domestic or household servants. Others were entertainers, bodyguards, and vendors. Some became boatmen and sailors, and a few even fought as knights in the armies of Europe. But the Portuguese were also experimenting with a new use for slave labor. As early as 1450, they had begun colonizing several small islands in the Atlantic Ocean just off the African coast. These islands included Sao Tome, Cabo Verde, and an archipelago called the Canary Islands. I assure you, I was not involved in any way. These islands didn't have much in the way of natural resources, but they were in a good climate for farming. So the Portuguese started setting up gigantic farms called plantations and cultivating cash crops, which means that the entire farm is used to grow a single high priced crop, which is then sold for a profit. Examples of cash crops include cotton and a blue dye called indigo, but the crop that really fueled the Atlantic slave trade was sugar cane. Harvesting and processing sugar cane is difficult and sometimes dangerous work, and these early plantations could not have operated without African slave labor. By 1500, some 50,000 enslaved Africans had been removed from the continent to work on these islands, and this plantation system soon became a model for slave based economies in the Americas.